He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
This is Mediawatch. I'm Colin Peacock. Well, as we mention quite a lot here on Mediawatch, many of our media outfits have big money worries these days, and the very viability of even the most established names in the market is uncertain and, in some cases, even unprofitable. But this Easter weekend, we look at one network that seems recession-proof. Indeed, it's expanding right now, both on air and online. They tell us it helps that they have almost half a century on air behind them, and they've got God in their corner as well.
Christianity is now a niche, and there are people that are really interested to go deeper in their faith and to be drawn closer to Jesus and what they're listening to and what they're viewing.
This Easter weekend, we look at how Rhema media does what it does. But first, what's it like to be a journalist who is jailed just for doing his job, and then to see the worst moments of your own life spread across the big screen?
Hamilton, Guy. Occupation, journalist. Jakarta, first assignment as foreign correspondent.
A reporter on the way in.
You're an enemy here, Hamilton, like all Westerners. I felt sorry for you. Guy Hamilton, right?
Right.
That was the trailer for The Year of Living Dangerously, an Australian movie from way back in 1982. It was directed by a young-ish Peter Weir and starred a very young Mel Gibson, both of whom went on to bigger things in Hollywood. In that movie, about a foreign correspondent who was dropped into Jakarta during the dramatic political revolution there in 1967, certainly helped. The events the movie depicts were real enough, but Mel Gibson's correspondent character, Guy Hamilton, was completely made up, partly for the purposes of what was essentially a romantic drama, also starring early career Sigourney Weaver. But there was no such romance and a lot more real life 25 years later in another movie with Indonesian upheaval as a backdrop and Aussie journalists in harm's way.
You need somebody younger.
Your country already sent young journalists, 5 of them.
Australian actor Anthony LaPaglia won awards for his performance in the movie Balibo as Roger East, a journalist killed in what was then East Timor, now Timor-Leste, back in December 1975. East was killed in the course of investigating the fate of 5 other journalists, including New Zealander Guy Cunningham, who were all killed during the Indonesian invasion of East Timor 2 months earlier, a crime that no one has ever paid for. Now, back in 1979, Sam Neill had a supporting role in another Australian film called The Journalist, this one a comedy about hacks working on a Sydney newspaper.
Hong Kong, a land of cheap transistors, Asian ladies, and swirling nightlife.
Simon in Hong Kong. Not without me, you know.
At the time, The Journalist was billed as a saucy, sexy, funny look at a man who can't say no, with a nose for scandal and a weakness for women. Not a movie likely to be made these days, but as a rule, it's been no laughing matter when they make movies about the real lives of Australian journalists. And so it is with the latest one just out, simply called The Correspondent. Now, this one tells the story of what happened to Peter Greste, an Australian journalist that I first met in newsrooms in London about 30 years ago. He'd worked for Reuters, CNN and the BBC, and went on to become a BBC correspondent in Afghanistan, and then Nairobi, from where he appeared regularly on 9 to Noon as its African news correspondent. Now, during a stint in Johannesburg, Peter Greste went on assignment in 2005 to Somalia with BBC colleague Kate Payton, who was shot alongside him on their first day in Mogadishu, and she died soon after in hospital. After that, Peter Greste joined the English-language network of the Doha-based broadcaster Al Jazeera, and then he became a worldwide story himself during a stint filling in for a colleague as a correspondent in a volatile time in Egypt. He and 2 Egyptian Al Jazeera colleagues, Bahia Mohammed and Mohammed Fahmy, were arrested on trumped-up charges of abetting and aiding the Muslim Brotherhood, an organisation labelled as terrorist by the new Egyptian regime at that time. 6 months later, Peter Greste was sentenced to 7 years in jail for falsifying news and smearing the reputation of Egypt itself. And in addition to media freedom groups pressing for the freedom of all 3, well, so was Peter's own family, including his eloquent dad, Juris Greste.
We put it to you that it is also a slap in the face and a kick in the groin to Australia, as well as all fair-minded people around the world. Journalism is not a crime or you should all be behind bars.
In the end, the pressure told, and Peter Greste was released and deported to Australia in February 2015. Now, technically, he was still supposed to serve his sentence there, and he would be behind bars again in Egypt if he ever went back there. But instead, Peter was appointed UNESCO Chair in Journalism and Communications at the University of Queensland, and now he's Professor of Media and Journalism at Macquarie University in Sydney. And among other things, he was a consultant on the new movie all about his own time in prison, The Correspondent.
It's kind of weird, or at least it was weird in the beginning, particularly when I really wasn't quite sure how to approach watching this. I eventually came to realise it's not me that's up there on the screen. It's the product of a whole bunch of creatives, you know. And the result then on screen is, I think as Greste said, it's more like a painting rather than a photograph. And so I've been able to watch it as an extraordinary work of art.
There is a headline in the Sydney Morning Herald, I watched it through my fingers, in quotes. So it sounds like it did stress you out a bit seeing the first cut.
There was that. The first cut was pretty challenging. Colin, I've written about it, I've spoken about it countless times, I've built a career on it. But what I wasn't really anticipating was the kind of emotional impact of seeing the craziness of my arrest, you know, the confusion of that period, the claustrophobia of the cell, the sheer frustration of the crazy trial, the really discombobulating moment of my release. All of that is nailed on screen in emotional terms in ways I didn't really anticipate. There is another parallel story, a very difficult story about what happened to a colleague of mine in Somalia, which I haven't spoken about publicly, and seeing that on screen was actually pretty gut-wrenching.
Yeah, that's right. So you're talking about Kate Payton there. Was it day one of on assignment in Somalia that happened? And you, I guess, were spared, but right there on the scene?
To see that displayed on screen was a pretty, as I said, a pretty tough thing to experience. But I am glad that they put it in there. But also underlined one of the core messages of the whole movie is the way in which journalism more broadly is under attack. That what happened to us in Egypt wasn't some sort of random isolated incident, but part of a much more tragic pattern that we're seeing continue to this day.
But in the film, the episode comes back to you in these series of flashbacks. But does that accurately represent what it was like for you? Because obviously in all those months in prison, you had a lot of time to think about the most vivid things in your life, and that was clearly number one. But did it keep coming back to you like it does in the film, just recurring?
Yeah, it did, Colin, because the prison is much, perhaps even more so, a psychological problem than a physical one. We tend to fixate on the walls and the bars and stuff that are around you. I started to drag up all sorts of demons from the past. I couldn't see the connection between what we'd actually done in Egypt and why we were in prison. There was nothing in our reporting that confirmed the allegations against us. And so I started thinking, well, if it's not my own journalism, maybe this is karma. Maybe this is the universe punishing me for sins of the past. You know, I was obviously digging up that particular moment as one of the most extreme and tragic moments of my past. It took a long time for me to get past it. Obviously, there's a bit of artistic license in there, but it really was something that haunted me in all sorts of dark moments. I kind of think you're right. The movies, you know, I spent 400 days inside Egypt's prisons. And you can't collapse that down into 2 hours without losing something. But I do think it does give you a sense of the way that time moves in various ways when you're in the box. Sometimes very quickly, a lot of the times very, very slowly.
One complication of this was, of course, you had your two Egyptian colleagues there, Bahir Mohammed and Mohammed Fahmy, and I guess things were different for them. So there were clearly differences between you about the position you were all in.
Yeah, to call it confrontation is probably a bit of an understatement. We had some really serious arguments, and sometimes they got very, very heated.
Because you weren't lifelong colleagues, right? You've been chucked together as a kind of fill-in in Cairo, right, when you went there. So
yeah, I'd only just met both Fahmy and Bahir. But one of the things I really wanted was that I wanted the audiences to really understand Fahmy's worldview, that he and I had very different understandings of what was going on and the politics behind it, and to understand how those differences played out. I've got a hell of a lot of respect for Fahmy. He is like a brother to me. And that doesn't mean we always agreed with each other. It doesn't mean we always got on with each other, like any siblings, I suppose. and you don't get a lot of choice about who your siblings are going to be. But it was important for everyone, I think, on the team who made this film to make those relationships understandable to audiences, to see, but also to recognise the genuine love that I think grew between us over time.
And I suppose, as you mentioned there, you don't get to choose who you're in prison with either. And in prison before you and still in prison in Egypt is Alaa Abd el-Fattah, who you mentioned. You've described him as best-known political prisoner in Egypt today. But you say he really helped you, give you some sort of psychological tools to help cope in prison. It ended up being some months, but could have been a much longer stretch.
Yeah, and in fact, Allah is an incredible character, easily one of the most intelligent, astute, charismatic humanitarians I've ever come across. He was one of the main pro-democracy activists who was behind the Arab Spring Revolution in Egypt of 2011. So he understood the psychology of it. He also understood the politics of it in ways that I could never do as a beginner, as a newcomer. For both psychological and for political reasons, I feel like I owe Allah my life. Unfortunately, he is still there. He should have been released on September 29th last year rather. His mother launched a hunger strike, and I actually joined her on a hunger strike for earlier this year to try and add pressure. Unfortunately, Allah is still in prison and his mother is still on a hunger strike. If this movie also draws a bit of attention to his case, then I think that's an important element.
When you say you owe him your life, what do you really mean there? Do you mean you don't think you would have survived a longer time in prison without the help from people like him?
I don't think so, no. He came to me at a time when I was really struggling, when I was in some very, very dark holes, when I was dredging up all of those demons from the past, not just Kate's murder, but other points in which I'd hurt other people, betrayed relationships and so on. He really helped me see that this wasn't about us, but about media freedom, and helped me understand and gave me some of the psychological strategies to make it through. And I genuinely believe the letters that I wrote under his guidance were the keys that created the campaign that ultimately got me out of prison. And I can't see that I'd have been released if it weren't for that. So for all of those reasons, yes, I don't think it's an understatement to say that I owe my life.
And you can't go back there, can you? Or if you did, technically, you could be in prison because your sentence was extended, right?
Kind of. I can't go back because I'm still a convicted terrorist and I still have an outstanding prison sentence to serve, which is a little bit weird. But what happened was that after I was released, there was a retrial that was ordered for me and my colleagues, and I was named as a defendant, even though I wasn't in the prison system. And once the retrial had ended, we were all reconvicted. And a few weeks later, after there was, again, further international outrage, they were finally released. But the pardon didn't extend to me. So there is, as far as I'm aware, there's still a prison cell waiting for me if I ever go back to Egypt. And I'm not planning on doing that anytime.
And what about elsewhere in the region, other countries close to Egypt? Do you even have to worry about that?
Yeah, of course, any country that has an extradition treaty with Egypt is a problem. Real problems travelling to the US, but also bizarrely to New Zealand. I was on a flight from New York back to Sydney. We were in transit in Auckland. The girl at the check-in counter said, "Listen, I'm terribly sorry, but there seems to be a problem. The New Zealand authorities have blocked you from getting on the plane. I'm not allowed into New Zealand without getting a visa because of that criminal record."
Extraordinary. Usually we're pretty happy to funnel Australians off the premises and back to where they came from. So that's a weird one. No, I would never have expected that.
It is a bizarre thing that I have to carry with me. And they ask, do you have any criminal offence? I have to say yes. And I have to say I was convicted on terrorism offences. And I hope, generally speaking, that I can explain it, but it often takes a lot of bureaucratic process to do that.
That was Peter Greste, former foreign correspondent who was jailed in Egypt a decade ago, along with two colleagues for Al Jazeera English, just for doing their job of journalism. And a new film about that time, The Correspondent, is in cinemas around New Zealand now. Now, Peter's own account of that, The First Casualty, was first published as a book in 2017. It's now been updated and republished as The Correspondent. Now, that book is also an account of the bigger picture of media freedom in a world which increasingly doesn't seem willing or able to preserve and protect it, something that Peter also now ponders a lot in his current job, Professor of Media and Journalism at Macquarie University in Sydney. And we had a chat about that issue as well, which we'll bring you here on Mediawatch next weekend. Someone else who's facing heat right now for making things public against the wishes of powerful people with vested interests is New Zealander Sarah Wynne Williams. Her recent book, Careless People, lifted the lid on many questionable things going on at Facebook when she worked there as a policy executive for 7 years, up to 2018. Now, Facebook, as we've heard here on Mediawatch, responded with legal action, effectively preventing her from talking about her own book and, legally speaking, from disparaging the company Meta, which owns Facebook. But they couldn't stop her testifying before an inquiry at the US Senate recently into Facebook's dealings with China.
Meta has attempted to dismiss these allegations as just old news, nothing to see here. Nothing new. Well, people watching and listening to you, Miss Lynn Williams, will know the importance and impact of what you have revealed to the American people and to the world.
It was Senator Richard Blumenthal addressing Sarah Wynne Williams in that Senate hearing, part of an investigation they've called A Time for Truth. Well, we were watching that too on the Senate Committee's live stream, and last Wednesday I talked about that on Midweek Mediawatch, our weekly catch-up with Emil Donovan on nights. We also talked about feedback on the latest annual survey of our trust in the news, and we also looked at what the TV Channel 3 is boldly calling the documentary event of the year, a 3-part series about the recent trial of Philip Polkinghorne for the murder of his wife Pauline Hanna, in which 2 key people, including him, who didn't speak in court, showed they weren't really shy of the camera.
I had no idea at all, because I'd never been arrested before, never been in a police station.
Can I sit like that? This is my best side. What I find very difficult to understand is that people don't believe that I was Philip Polkinghorne's partner for several years.
If you missed Midweek Mediawatch, you'll find it on our podcast page at rnz.co.nz, or you'll find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This Easter weekend, RNZ National, as is customary at this time of year, dropped bits of Christian programming into the schedule on the key days. For example, on Good Friday there was a BBC Witness documentary about radio carbon dating of the Turin Shroud, and that was followed by a chat with the author of The Life of Pi, Jan Martel, explaining why many of his novels draw inspiration from religion. And then the Easter church service. This year, the Eucharist Mass from St Mary of the Angels Church in Wellington, repeated at 11 o'clock on Sunday night. Meanwhile, commercial News Talk ZB changed its regular programming for those 2 days, when airing commercials is not actually allowed by law. For now anyway. Instead, with funding from New Zealand On Air, it carried hours of special faith-based daytime programming prepared by the Christian Broadcasting Association, an outfit funded by broadcaster John Hawkesby and others back in the 1970s. And the CBA has also been making programs like this for ZB for 27 years now, in the hope of, they say, reaching hundreds of thousands of people who may not step into a church. Well, after Easter, it will, of course, be back to commercial business as usual on News Talk ZB. But before and after Easter, one media company is providing Christian faith-based broadcasting every day, as it has for almost half a century. Indeed, this week, Mediawatch was surprised to learn that when Rhema Media launched its first radio station here in 1978, it became the first Christian broadcasting company on the air in the entire British Commonwealth. Now, back then, it had a bigger target market here. Around 80% of New Zealanders identified as Christian at the time, and church music was a Sunday staple. But only 32% claimed to be Christian in the 2023 census, and 52% stated they had no religion at all. Contemporary Christian music has also been on a bit of a downward trajectory. Hamilton's Parachute Festival, once the largest Christian music event in the Southern Hemisphere, was shut down more than a decade ago on the back of dwindling ticket sales. But on the air, Rhema Media is still trucking along. In fact, they're getting bigger. It recently launched Sanctuary, a new FM network, and it's now invested in new mobile apps, which also include the long-running AM station Radio Rhema and the youth-oriented radio brand Life FM. And there's also the Shine TV channel, available on the Freeview platform, Sky TV and online. And there's also been a bit of media watching. On Rhema's weekly multimedia current affairs show Trending, billed as a show all about the news New Zealanders have been searching for literally on Google.
Trending with Andrew Curtis.
Starting off internationally, I find these fascinating.
And this week on the show, Andrew Curtis and his co-host Josh weren't too impressed with the pseudo-spiritual pronouncements made by pop star Katy Perry when she returned to Earth after her 11-minute spell as an astronaut.
The hollowness of that spiritual experience
Sure.
bleeds through, and I just wonder if that's, again, an overarching element of her journey.
Well, what, she's become more hollow as time's gone along?
Spiritually, potentially, yeah.
Now, is that a little bit petty on poor old Katy Perry? Maybe, but it's not like there weren't others also having a big dig at her this week on other networks on the dial. In a world of fragmented audiences and financial pressure on all media companies, Mediawatch's Hayden Donnell wanted to know how Rhema Media has bucked the trend. Not only that, how are they navigating a tricky and sometimes contradictory cultural landscape for Christianity right now, where evangelicals in the US, and some here in New Zealand, have aligned themselves with Donald Trump and the MAGA movement? And coincidentally, Trending's Andrew Curtis was not a big fan of some of that on his show last week.
By the way, that's a bigger discussion about why Trump became so popular, because these elitists with their heads so far up their proverbials can't seem to understand that for people who are at the lower end of society, who maybe don't have the highest skill levels for whatever reason, you can debate why that is, but they're not able to take these high-paying professional jobs, are having their jobs eaten by robots and overseas manufacturing. So, yeah.
Now, here in New Zealand, some Christian denominations have become more progressive on political issues, sometimes controversially so. For example, 440 ministers recently collectively opposed ACT's Treaty Principles Bill, an issue that, as we know, has divided many communities and social groups. So Hayden asked Rhema's chief executive Luke Weston and its head of content Elmo Johnston how they cater to Christians right across the broad church.
Kia ora, Luke and Elmo. Welcome to Mediawatch.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
What is the funding model? How do you guys stick around?
Well, ultimately we're around because our listeners want us to be around. You know, we're primarily listener funded. We're a not-for-profit. We do run some advertising, but that only funds a very small portion of what we do. The majority of what we need to operate is provided to us by our listeners and viewers who just are passionate about what we do.
I think, Luke, I saw an interview where you called it the first subscription model. You were the first Herald Premium sort of.
Well, that's right. Yeah, it's that kind of supporter funded model that now has become very popular. But the great thing about that, and it's really like 95% of our funding comes from supporters, is that you do have a mandate to continue.
So I imagine that a large percentage of that funding comes from a small percentage of people. Is that the case, that you have some really big benefactors that are the backbone of your financial support?
Not so much. It comes from just thousands of people giving what they can. We have about 30,000 supporters around New Zealand, and it's always amazing for us that when we do go and ask for money, it's seemingly a small amount spread over thousands of people that make it happen.
But does it make you kind of immune from some of the struggles that the media is going through now, that you have this relatively reliable source of funding?
Yeah, I mean, everyone's looking for a niche in the media space, and I love that about the time that we're in. You know, podcasts have really opened that up. Christianity is now a niche in broadcasting, and there are people that are really interested to go deeper in their faith and to be drawn closer to Jesus and what they're listening to and what they're viewing. As long as that niche exists, I think we've got a future. We're bringing new supporters in at one end. There's a sort of attrition at the other end, and that's happening across the board. At the moment, bequest giving is quite large in New Zealand, so a lot of not-for-profits are focusing on that. Yeah, there are still supporters.
Sort of echo what's happened with Christianity at large. You have fewer Christians out there. I imagine that it affects your supporter base, but maybe some of the people that are from more widely Christian are dying, and that is helping you with the bequest. Is that something that's happening?
When you look at Christian radio around the world, many of whom operate under a similar kind of listener-supported model, it's such a small percentage of those who listen actually give. I think what you're finding as the numbers of Christians around the world may be falling, but those who are still kind of in the faith tend to be more committed and strong, like they're really passionate about it. And so, the numbers, when you look at a census, the numbers of Christians may be going down, but I wouldn't say the number of supporters of Christian not-for-profits is going down. I think that's pretty...
Right, so there's a retrenchment around people that are really committed to the cause.
Yeah.
CCM, Christian Music Industry. I went to a few parachute festivals back in the day, 20 years ago, whenever it was on, and it seems like that had a heyday back then, maybe 20 years ago, where you had bands like DC Talk or the Newsboys or Jars of Clay cutting through to the mainstream. And it feels like there's been a bit of a decline there as well. Has that impacted how you operate? Have you had to pivot?
Yeah, I think that just like any music genre, there have been things that have come in and out in terms of its popularity. Yeah, certainly kind of Christian chart music had its heyday and is not as popular as it once was. But worship has become very, very big internationally. And
is that what you would generally play, worship music, like explicitly church music now?
No, we have a station that we've now dedicated to worship called Sanctuary, and then we play sort of bits of worship through the other formats, and we still play Christian chart music, but certainly even in New Zealand, the number of bands that, would be exclusively Christian in what they're doing, that's diminished as well, so the local scene is not as strong as it once was.
Because back in the day, you wouldn't really hear bands that weren't explicitly Christian on Life FM, your youth station, for instance. Have you broadened that out so that you have the kind of Christian-friendly bands, I think of U2s of the world?
We still are pretty strong in what we will and won't play, but I think, it's not every song on Life FM is going to be about Jesus, but every song on Life FM is going to be from someone who follows Jesus.
You wouldn't have Christian-friendly but not explicitly Christian people? I don't know what Bono calls himself or whatever, that kind of person.
When you get program directors into a room and you start selecting music, if you had 10 of them, you'd do it 10 different ways. So, we're always having conversation about...
You're like, is there a test that you guys apply here? Like a set of... you have to get to 5 of the 10 markers of Christianity to make it to the Life FM playlist.
I mean, for us, it's very simple. We just listen to the song and go, is that going to help us in what we believe we're here to do? Is it going to help with the sound of the station? Is it going to be good for the listener? Just like any other radio format would do.
Except for you have a slightly different requirement here. I mean, you are a Christian music station, so you kind of have to have a link to Christianity in the music.
Yeah.
I think there are also real cultural differences in Christianity now across the world, particularly American Christianity, which seems to have been entwined quite a lot in MAGA. The Donald Trump cult of personality, they seem very enmeshed in parts. What do you feel about that and actually playing music that comes out of that?
Yeah, certainly I think society has become more polarised in general. And then I think religion, because of that, has become more polarised also. And it is exemplified by what you see in America, and that sort of republicanism, which then became sort of evangelical Christian as well, and then a lot of those moral issues, which seem to matter so very deeply to American voters. New Zealand has been somewhat sheltered from that, but it has definitely started to creep in. And we've often kind of talked about the fact that Christianity is a very diverse, religious belief. It's sort of everything that exists from Mother Teresa through to maybe Brian Tamaki, on the other side. And so, Christians have very different theological, philosophical, beliefs. And if you're the Christian media outlet, to try and skate somewhere in the middle where you're offering something to everybody is, it's a challenge. But we feel like we do it pretty well. And I think that's also something we were talking about before, just that the polls in media have been difficult to go close to. You would purposely stay away from the far right or the far left. And I like the fact that now we're able to release content that might be appealing to people who sit on either side. And you don't have to listen or you don't have to view if you're not interested, which is really the viewer on demand or listen on demand model, which I think has been really great for the audience.
I remember a band, Skillet, they were fed up to me on my Instagram feed again recently. It was the lead singer has dyed blonde hair. He looked quite effeminate, actually. Now he's fully in a cowboy hat singing, "My faith, my family is all that matters." Like, this is the transition that you've had in the US Christian music industry. Is that an uncomfortable fit for you guys, though? Because I look at your annual report, there's Te Reo Māori through it. There's hints of liberalism, which I'm not sure you would see in the US.
As Luke said, the evangelical Christian kind of mesh with republicanism is quite a big thing in the US. But here, I know people and have friends who are supporters of the Greens, who are Christians, who are supporters of National, who are Christians, and ACT, and New Zealand First, and Te Pāti Māori. And I think in New Zealand is a lot more diverse, not just as a society, but also in the church. And I don't think it's quite as, I guess, black and white as the US would see it. But I haven't seen a massive impact as far as the music that comes to us from the record labels and that kind of stuff. It's not like here's our next single and we love Donald Trump. Like it's not quite that.
It's still
explicit.
about Jesus.
Yeah, it's like they're what their political beliefs may or may not be is somewhat irrelevant to the song in its own right and the strengths of the song.
What do you do, though, if you do get pressure from parts of your listenership? You have conservative Christians and you have liberal Christians as well, to take stances on moral issues. And are you purposely not outspoken? Are you purposely trying to go through the centre? What are you doing?
I think that we have different programming for different, functions.
So you're trying to be a broad church, essentially, is what you're saying there.
Well, we're not denominational, so we don't fit under one church eldership. It's not paid for by one, as you said before, one massively rich Christian benefactor. So we can afford to be independent, we do have to try and be as neutral as we can on a lot of those issues. We'll get involved in the things that we really feel draw people closer to knowing who this person Jesus is, and for us that's a very clear mandate. It's not that we're not political, it's just that we know what our focus is.
And putting you on the spot, but can you give an example of what that might be? An issue that you might stand up on?
For us, the euthanasia is something that we took a strong stance on, and the sanctity of human life we were able to speak into well, and we did a lot of some great interviews, I think, and some great resources for the audience when that issue was before New Zealanders. That was a time where I think we took a stance.
Were you sort of, as the media tends to do, trying to show both sides of the story, or were you really doing advocacy on that issue?
We're not journalists, so that idea that we would cover the story from all perspectives, if someone else was looking at it, it might look like we just took a certain line, but we did that in line with what we believe.
You've just launched a news station, Sanctuary. It replaces Star. Can you just explain why you've done that?
Ultimately, the listenership in Star was declining, and we want to reach as many people as we possibly can with it. Before my time returning to Rhema, I've worked there after doing some research and looking at where there were gaps, kind of landed on a station that focuses on the kind of songs that churches all around New Zealand are singing as part of their church services every Sunday. Moving away from a demographic where the Star had an older demographic of 55 plus, to more of a people who love worship music, people who love sing the music we chose to put on Sanctuary. Some of it is also on the Life FM playlist. Some of it was also on the Star playlist, and some of it may be from Rhema, and then we've added other music in, and just kind of got this consolidated station of worship music. And the feedback we're getting from a really broad audience is that people are really engaging with it.
One of the things about Sanctuary that it says on your website is that there will be no long-form teaching content anymore. Now, can you explain what exactly teaching content is and why there apparently isn't an appetite for it?
Well, that's in reference to the station that Sanctuary replaced, essentially. It was Star, that was a mix of music, and it had long-form Bible teaching. So essentially preaching and sermons and that kind of thing. And essentially, we have a radio network that does that most of the time. So there's a lot of that kind of content on Rhema. So if there is an appetite for people to listen to that, most of the content that was already available on Star was on Rhema as well. So there's still an outlet for that. But also with podcasting and audio on demand, most of that content is available at the touch of a button, and we're working with some of those partners who provided that content at looking at the possibilities of including that in our app and on our websites and that kind of stuff, where people can listen to it at a time that suits them, rather than putting it, it's got to be on at this time every morning.
Is Rhema still your most popular station?
No, Life FM is actually the biggest network.
When
now.
did it take over?
2012 is when the numbers...
That's a long time. Okay, so
Yeah.
right. And are you quite pleased with that, Luke? You're a Life FM alumni. Both of you are, aren't you?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it makes sense technologically. That's our big FM network across New Zealand. AM, RNZ knows this is a bit of a problem. So we're also having to transition our audience onto new digital technology and try and transition away from some of those heritage broadcasting outlets as well.
Another thing you guys launched in February is there's a Sanctuary app and also there's a Rhema app. Now, is there any particular considerations that you have to make as a Christian organisation when you're designing these apps?
No, because ultimately the app that we've got is essentially an off-the-shelf app that someone else has built that a lot of other radio stations are already using. We've just skinned it with our look and feel and filled it with our content. So, I mean, ultimately we just want to be using a platform that's reliable, that works, and that people are going to find really easy to use.
You don't have to buy it from a Jesus-friendly app design shop.
When you open it, it goes, hallelujah.
Okay, well, at least there's
but that would be cool.
Thank goodness.
That's making it to the promo.
Will you do news and current affairs, or is it just going to be religious programming for you guys?
We do some current affairs. We have interview shows, but we tend to put them on Rhema is our talk brand, or more talk than the other brands.
Do you have any idea what the listenership is in Shine and Life and Rhema? Is that something that you monitor? Is it important to you?
Yeah, we definitely do the radio surveys. Nielsen take care of our TV stats for us. Shine TV has an audience of about 130,000 viewers a week. All up, we hit about 10% of the New Zealand population with radio and TV. There's still room for us, I think, to grow and to do more. And like I said before, I think it's great to have that niche product in the market. If you are a person that is Christian or you're interested in Christianity, you know exactly where to go.
You talk about a sanctuary. Obviously, Christianity hasn't necessarily been a sanctuary for some communities, queer communities in particular, in the past. Now, would they find a place listening to your products? Is there anything for them?
Yeah, we would hope that anybody listening to our brands didn't ever feel judged or ostracized, and it's something that we've talked about a lot. And that's what we believe the gospel is too. It's a shame that it's been caught up in all of those things. And I would suggest that is human nature as well, that we find ways to divide ourselves. But we believe it's a very inclusive message. It's a very welcoming message. And we try and make our radio products and our TV products deliberately inclusive.
What happens if that culture war creeps in and people start saying, look, I am not going to support you anymore unless you take a strong stance on this culture war issue or that culture war issue, or from either side of the political spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, we already have those conversations and we already have those people. It's something that we just have to continue to navigate. Look, I think as a society, we've all got to ask ourselves that question and we're all going to have to navigate through it. It's like, I think there's exponential change in our culture. We're coming to terms with what it means to be a nation that also honours our Te Reo Māori, heritage and our tikanga Māori. There's a whole bunch of stuff happening in New Zealand, and we're kind of pleased to be a part of that, and we're up for having the conversations about what it looks like in the future too.
There was Rhema Media's Chief Executive Luke Weston and the organisation's Head of Content Elmo Johnston, talking there to Mediawatch's Hayden Donnell about running the country's pioneering Christian broadcaster and how they cater to Christians across the denominations on Radio Rhema, Life FM, Shine TV and the new worship music station Sanctuary. That's it for this Easter weekend. Thanks for listening. We'll be back again next week. And if you have any thoughts to share with us or ideas for us to follow up, or you spot anything you think we should know about, do get in touch. Email us mediawatch@rnz.co.nz, or you'll also find us at MediawatchNZ on X. And you can even write us a letter and send it to PO Box 123 Wellington. Hayden will be back next Wednesday with Midweek Media Watch. Catch you then. In the meantime, follow Media Watch and listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any podcast app to make sure you never miss an episode.